Now we have 3 questions that have been prepared. And the first question, I'm advised, will be asked by Ms. Michelle Dawson-Beatty. Michelle, you want to grab a mic back there? Yes, yeah, please.
I'm coming down with a cold, so bear with me. The first question is, across the country, there are problems with implementing final land claims and self-government agreements where they exist, and problems moving forward on reconciliation with First Nation governments where no agreements are in place. What is your party prepared to do in terms of working with these Yukon First Nations on government-to-government basis on honoring and implementing treaties and Aboriginal title? What is your commitment to working with First Nations who do not have treaties?
Thank you very much for that, Michelle. So I will now ask, to start that off, Mr. Bagnell.
Thank you.
2 minutes.
Thank you. That's a great first question, because that was my highest priority when I was in Parliament. The Auditor General has noted several times that the implementation, especially in the north, of treaties is not being done under the honour of the Crown, not being done fairly. I've stood with you across the north fighting for implementation. If we return to government, we will once again have government-to-government relations, restore the honour of the Crown, and have good faith negotiations. And it has to be not with just the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, but all departments. The federal government doesn't understand that when we signed the treaties, it's all departments, so each department has a responsibility to negotiate in good faith. Also, just before the election, the government tabled the Department on Canada's fiscal approach to self-government. That certainly has a lot of problems that needs to be re-looked at. In it, just a few of the problems: one size does not fit all. You can't remove the guarantee to negotiate, which is right in your self-government agreements, by having this one-size-fit-all new policy. Even for the non-signed ones, it's a bad precedent, because then when you come to the table with the ones you're negotiating, what are they going to say? There's no negotiating mandates, there's unnecessary reporting requirements, it ignores nation-to-nation agreements, and it doesn't even deal adequately, at least from your perspective, with own source revenues, funding comparability, and revenue adequacy. When I talk to the unsigned First Nations in the Yukon, they don't have any interest in the near future of signing, but I'm certainly willing to work with them on 2 things. One, to make sure the services that are delivered to them are delivered appropriately and delivered well, and the programs that they deliver, they get adequate funding for. Once again, sitting down on a government-to-government relationship, and to come up with unique arrangements with them so that they can prosper and be equal citizens with everyone else in the territory. Thank you.
Mr. Leaf.
Thank you. We heard an interesting note in the introductory remarks, of course, that it was in the 1960s that First Nation people were first given the right to vote. And that was long and hard fought, and it was under a Conservative government that was achieved, and under the leadership of Eric Nielsen at the time as our Conservative Member of Parliament here. And from that point, we've seen the Yukon sign on more than half of the modern treaty agreements that exist in this country today, and it's a record I think we can all be very proud of. 11 of our First Nations in this territory are self-governing out of the 14. And I think it's important that Canada continues to work in a government-to-government fashion to make sure the implementation is put in place in the way the agreements were written. They're, of course, living documents, so priorities change from time to time. Priorities different from community to community. Each of our First Nations are distinct and have a collective voice through CYFN, but very much have their own priorities for their own community and their own people in their own region. And it's a challenging task to make sure that we meet financial capacity with human resource capacity for First Nation to be able to deliver the services that they want to take down. And we hear across each community, as I've met with them over the last 4 years, some of the very real challenges of having a smaller workforce, but larger governments that need to deploy a lot of resources and limited skills to draw from, or bringing people back home that have left their communities to seek employment or seek opportunity elsewhere. So part of the relationship I think Canada can engage in is making sure that we're supporting with the right financial contributions so that local communities can determine what their priorities are. Local First Nations can dictate exactly what's meaningful to them at a given time. And then they can deliver those services on their own and on their own behalf, because they're in the best position to do that for their people for years to come. Thank you.
Ms. Atkinson.
Yes, the New Democrats recognize the inherent right to self-government, that self-government agreements empower Yukon First Nations to govern themselves in a manner that's responsive to the needs and interests of their people. That acting in good faith and ensuring that agreements are implemented is absolutely crucial to their success. And that the Government of Canada signed these agreements, but often seems to forget its obligations. That Yukon First Nations self-government agreements, financial transfer agreements require that the parties engage in government-to-government negotiations. And the NDP and I will do that. An NDP government will work with Land Claims Agreement Coalition to address issues identified by the LCAC implementation policy. We will work with Yukon First Nations to ensure sustainable, predictable, and reliable long-term funding. We'll ensure that we have the equitable access to programs and services, and want to genuinely build a new relationship and a new era of change to work with Aboriginal people across Canada, and that has to be based first and foremost on honor and respect. And looking at the promises of the past Liberal and Conservative governments, to look closely at that. Even the Liberals recently announced a few weeks ago about promising First Nation education. Now, just before the election, that is now clawed back from 515 down to 400, down 400. That's some 65% cuts on the original promise, even before we get to the polls. So if they're talking in those terms already, I need to caution you on what other promises are rolling out from the Liberals, and certainly looking at the commitments of what we've heard on how we've been able to work with the Conservative government, which has not been on a nation-to-nation basis. I will bring that voice of the future in honor and respect on behalf of all Yukoners.
Mr. de Jong.
When I joined the Green Party, I soon figured out that the Green Party had the values that are very similar to First Nation values, if not exactly the same. It's the consensus decision-making, the democracy aspect, ecological wisdom, and living on the land carefully. Those are the values of the Green Party. So it's a very close match, and it was very comfortable for me to be in a party that shared the values. And indeed, the Green Party chose its values based on the Six Nations in Brantford, Ontario. That was part of the committees of correspondence, part of the Green Party's initial ideas. We have seen governments negotiating with First Nations, and it's not even in good faith. And in fact, the YESA agreement, which was all stakeholders in, we've only too familiar that the present government, Mr. Harper in Ottawa, and the territorial government are abrogating the original consensual decisions that make up the umbrella final agreement. And that's extremely disconcerting. And so the Green Party would absolutely negotiate in good faith and make sure that we stick to the negotiations that we have. There's another aspect to this, and that is the private industry, because we're seeing that private industry is much more progressive than our Conservative government in Ottawa and in Whitehorse, for that matter. The Boreal Leadership Council, which includes the Toronto-Dominion Bank, Suncor, and Tembec, a huge forestry company in Northern Ontario, have already agreed that they want to give First Nations unilaterally a veto power of any activities on their land. They want First Nations to have first and informed consent. In Attawapiskat, it's written in the margins of Treaty 9 that the negotiators knew that they were not being, that the First Nations did not understand what was happening, and that's all got to change. Thank you.